Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Chinese Premier Li Qiang has wrapped up a three-nation tour to New Zealand, Australia and Malaysia, a visit that analysts say highlights China's efforts to further strengthen ties with countries in the Asia-Pacific region amid rising economic and security challenges. What were some of the major outcomes of the Premier's visit to the three countries, and what can we expect in future bilateral ties? And how does the future of prosperity and stability look in the Indo-Pacific region? Join us for our discussion today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Professor Chen Hong, Director of the Australian Studies Centre at East China Normal University, Professor James Laurenceson, Director of the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney, and Dr. Syed Mahmud Ali, Distinguished Fellow with the Centre for New Inclusive Asia. Well, Dr. Ali, I will start with the latest. Tell us, what are the priorities of the current government of Malaysia in terms of its relationship with China?
As we have seen over the last day plus, the two leaders have met several times. Their officials have signed 15 memoranda of understanding. They've also signed a major agreement to renew a 5-year project. So it's very largely economic and political economic. Malaysia has been one of the early members that signed onto the Belt and Road Initiative of China. And it has benefited a great deal from a lot of project funding. Some of the projects have had to be modified over time, particularly for the period of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, when things had to stop. So there have been revisions, but now everything seems to be back in shape. And we have relationship which had been very strong since 1974, have been reinforced by these visit of the Chinese Premier.
Professor Chen Hong, if you look at the overall tour to the three nations, in particular to New Zealand and Australia, how do you characterize the tour by Premier Li?
Yeah, Premier Li Qiang's visit, I think, is quite unique in that actually it includes, the three countries. He starts from New Zealand and then stop at Australia and then completes the whole itinerary at Malaysia. So it's a kind of a wide-ranging Asia-Pacific visit rather than to be focusing on a particular area such as the Oceania area. So I think actually this reflects a kind of general diplomatic outlook and also strategic thinking of the whole international scenario on the part of the Chinese side.
Now, if you look at these achievements, the highlights of the tour, what do you have to say?
Very interestingly, because previously in a number of visits by the Chinese leaders to New Zealand and also Australia, they start usually from Australia and then, move on to New Zealand. But this time, the visit starts from New Zealand, so it indicates a kind of emphasis on part of China on the importance of China-New Zealand relationship. Another thing is that actually, of course, this is the first time for the Chinese Premier and also the New Zealand new Prime Minister Christopher Luxon to meet each other. So I think this is really a kind of recognition of the importance of the bilateral relationship, the solidified history of the bilateral relationship, and on which, of course, the two sides are ready to know about each other, to exchange views, and to move on to a higher level.
Well, James, of course, we know China has said to include New Zealand and Australia in the list of the unilateral visa-free countries. China also offered pandas to Australia. So how is that received in Australia?
Yeah, look, very well. Of course, they're positive initiatives, particularly amongst the Australian business community, of course, that visa-free travel will be welcomed. And also, let's not forget that both Australia and New Zealand have extremely large Chinese diasporas. So they're folks who began their lives in China but now living in Australia, but they travel frequently between the two countries. So that's definitely to be welcomed. Of course, who doesn't love a panda? So our Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, said she particularly welcomed the fact that we'd be getting 2 new pandas to Adelaide Zoo.
Well, that adds a lot, a positive element, let's say, to the relationship. James, on China-Australia relationship, can we say we are back on track, fully recovered from the time of Morrison government's, frictions, a lot of strong rhetoric against each other. Now we are focusing on the trade and investment?
Yeah, look, it hasn't been an easy few years, has it? Since 1972, when Australia and China began diplomatic relations, they settled on a pretty simple diplomatic formula, and that was both sides would recognise and acknowledge, state their differences. But second of all, they wouldn't dwell on those differences. They would manage them calmly and professionally, and they wouldn't let them be the entirety of the relationship or spill over to hurt areas of mutual cooperation and mutual benefit. Now, as you said, starting in 2017, but certainly in 2020, I think both sides, frankly, lost sight of that original formula. The Morrison Australian government, in my view, started using some extraordinarily loose and provocative rhetoric, and I don't think the Chinese response was very helpful, hitting a number of Australian goods, restricting their access to the Chinese market. But now, since the Albanese government came to power 2 years ago, you've seen the diplomatic rhetoric certainly become more calm and professional from Australia, and in turn, Beijing's now removed most of those trade restrictions. So we're certainly on a more positive path now.
And of course, speak of the factors, beyond the bilateral scope, James, of course, we have to acknowledge the fact that the U.S. is a big factor in terms of the bilateral relationship, Australia has with China, New Zealand has with China, or other countries here in the region. I mean, how big a factor is that? And also you argued in one piece that, despite this security alliance with the U.S., Australia demonstrated its independence in terms of its approach to China. Tell us more on that.
Sure. Look, I'm an economist, so I'll focus my comments on that area. It seems to me that when it comes to trade, the World Trade Organization, Canberra actually has a closer alignment with Beijing than it does with Washington. I think back to 2018 when the Trump administration put in place tariffs on Chinese imports outside the World Trade Organization. The Australian Trade Minister immediately came out and said that we did not support those tariffs. In October 2022, when the Biden administration put in place export controls on China, trying to restrict access to advanced semiconductors, our trade minister again immediately came out and described those measures as quote unquote draconian. Our foreign minister says we want more trade with China. We see trade and economic links with China as being not only good for our prosperity, but good for our security and regional stability as well. Now, those are all points that I don't think Washington shares at this point in time.
Well, Professor Chen Hong, I want to respond to that. Do you think often in China, people would say, oh, Australia, in terms of its China policy, often is in line with the U.S. If you look at the South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan issue, for example. So do you think we also appreciate there's a difference, subtle difference probably in terms of their approach to China and the U.S. approach on China?
Yeah, definitely. I agree that actually Australia has got different diplomatic concerns from the United States. Australia is an independent country, it is a sovereign country, and it has its own pivot to its own, national interests to consider. I seriously don't agree that Australia is always blindly following the United States. But on the other hand, of course, the Australia-U.S. alliance is always a cornerstone of Australia's foreign policy, foreign diplomatic policies. So on that consideration, there are a kind of allegiance or alliance between these two countries. Well, China has no position on that. Whoever Australia forms an alliance or grouping or partnership with, it is Australia's business. But on the ground, that actually, of course, when such a kind of a grouping or alliance or clique, military clique or political clique, to be formed at the expense of China's national interest, to provoke China, to threaten China's national core interests, such as sovereignty or territorial integrity, China definitely opposes that. For example, like AUKUS, of course, China definitely opposes any formation of a military clique that aims at China's national interests. So that is actually we resolutely will be responding to, and of course will be showing our opposition towards such moves.
Let's have a short break. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back. Well, James, it seems that during this tour, Premier Li's tour to Australia, there's not much talked about about the differences, in particular on security issues. Instead, there's a focus on the pragmatic cooperation, in particular in trade, investment, and of course education. MOUs on education, climate change, etc. So we are seeing, so the resilience probably, despite all the talk of how fragile the relationship could be in a sense.
Yeah, Chindo, it's always struck me that, when you think about Australia-China relations, you don't need to encourage or incentivize Australian and Chinese companies very hard to work together, or Australian and Chinese people to be friendly together. Australian and Chinese people get along very well. The companies recognise the complementarities. So I think the responsibility of our political leaders is to ensure that political stability, and then off that foundation, the businesses and households, individuals will get on with the job of engagement. That's been the real story. And even during that tough political time a few years ago, two-way trade actually increased during that period. So that's just one illustration of the resilience of the broader Australia-China relationship.
Well, of course, we mentioned about this outside factor, the U.S. factor. Dr. Ali, there's a pressure from Washington. At least some countries feel the pressure to choose side or to shift a little bit of their policy on China, toward China. But the Malaysian Prime Minister, Anwar, in a recent interview, made it very clear that his government has no intention of picking sides in another's game. And in fact, restated Malaysia's interest to deepen and broaden cooperation with China. He said that in contrast to we know that it is Western portrayal of China as regional bully. The Chinese, in his words, quote, have been most receptive, and they collaborate well, and they are frank and make no display of arrogance, end quote. I want your comments on that.
It is not that China and Malaysia see eye to eye on everything. There are quite serious differences. They have maritime territorial difference in the South China Sea, and they've had that for many years now. But Malaysia's determined policy has been to say that these are regional concerns which must be jointly, collectively negotiated painstakingly, so that solutions that emerge from discussions, people can accept them because they provide something for everybody. It's mutually acceptable, and governments can then implement them with popular support. That process, I think, has continued for, I would say, decades now, and is still continuing. We are approaching a period when the ASEAN countries, of which Malaysia is a founding member, and China must come out with some sort of a draft of the code of conduct in the maritime realm, in the domain in the South China Sea particularly. That is expected. Now, if we have also seen different members of ASEAN, particularly the Philippines, as we know, has chosen a different approach to addressing this problem with China. Malaysia has consistently, for many decades, said this is a diplomatic issue that we must resolve by negotiation peacefully, and we cannot allow this to boil over into some sort of a confrontation. This has been the consistent position of successive governments of Malaysia, and Prime Minister Anwar is simply building on that legacy that he has inherited.
James, of course, if you look at New Zealand, Australia, and Malaysia, both important trading partners with China, strong relationship there. But when they are, responding to what's happening in South China Sea, in Taiwan, why Australia is acting so differently from, say, Malaysia? Malaysia is far closer than Australia from China.
Yeah, look, to state the obvious, every country has its own distinct national interests. Look, I think on China's core interests, and I don't think China has a more core interest than Taiwan, I have been struck by just how disciplined the Albanese Australian government has been on that topic. I remember when you had the Speaker of the US, Congress Nancy Pelosi, go to Taiwan, our foreign minister immediately came out and called for both sides to de-escalate. There was a lot of American shock, in fact, that our our foreign minister wasn't just directing comments to China, she was directing comments to Washington as well. We all know that President Biden has made a number of at least rhetorical stumbles, perhaps even signalling a watering down of Washington's one China policy. There's been no watering down of Australia's one China policy at all. So look, I think in that area, the Australian government has been very disciplined.
Professor Chen Hong, of course, you have been studying this, a comprehensive relationship between China with New Zealand, with Australia. There's a concern, surrounding the visit by the Premier to New Zealand, to Australia. There's talk of New Zealand joining the so-called Pillar 2 of the AUKUS military, whatever we call it, military alliance between US, Australia, and the UK. There's concern on the Chinese side. And so where are we now? I mean, how big a concern is it to China?
Well, first of all, I think the issue with AUKUS is a serious matter. The so-called AUKUS, as I said, is a military grouping, pulled together by the United States to date, consisting of its Anglophone allies, the UK and Australia. This military clique's target, its strategic target is China, and that is why China adamantly, resolutely opposes this military grouping. Whether it is Pillar 1 or Pillar 2, it is still a part of AUKUS, which propose to use the military weaponry, AI, quantum technology, and whatsoever, for military purposes against Chinese interests and China's security. So it is a feeble contention to argue that Pillar 1 is nuclear and Pillar 2 is non-nuclear. But even when it is non-nuclear, it proposes to threaten China's security. That is why we believe countries, including New Zealand, need to assume a strategic prudence and political wisdom to adopt a balanced policy stance towards this matter. To rush into a military grouping which takes China as its strategic target is in fact reckless. So I hope that the New Zealand side will take a sensible and prudent approach. On the other hand, of course, Australia is already in this grouping, but on this formation, Australia also needs a kind of sensibility to handle the matter rather than, to be forcing itself into a confrontational stance with China, against China. That would be sacrificing the hard-won victory we have achieved so far.
Well, some observers, are saying that, ties between China and Australia and New Zealand, they are a kind of a model of relations between China and the Western countries, and that Premier Li's visit highlights the fact that China is willing to retain friendly ties with Western countries if they seek pragmatic cooperation and hold on to strategic autonomy. Do you agree with that perception or perspective there, rather?
Yes, I agree. China's relations with New Zealand has been, well, as we have been saying, taking the lead among China's relationships with Western countries. We often mention the many firsts, so to speak. New Zealand is the first Western country to recognize China's market economy status, support China's bid to join the WTO, and of course to engage with China under the Belt and Road framework. I believe the most important reason is that New Zealand has persisted in its independence in making political, diplomatic, foreign affairs, decisions and policies. The most important consideration for Wellington has been its own national interest, long-term national interest, rather than about side-taking, about the political camps. I believe, China-New Zealand relations has played an exemplary role for, Western countries handling their relationship with China.
Well, James, if you look at this visit to Australia, we do have like opinions over the past couple of years. We are seeing improvement, in terms of how Chinese view Australia and how Australia view China. For example, here's the findings from, say, Global Times Institute, showing that in 2024, the average favorable rating of Chinese people towards Australia increased to 69.2, almost 70%, higher than the scores of the past 3 years. At the same time, a recent poll from Australian think tank, Australia's Australia-China Relations Institute, indicates that 61% of respondents believe Australia should continue to try to build strong connections and ties and have a strong relationship with China. Of course, at the same time, during the visit, we see the two countries sign MOUs on, as I said, education, research, climate change, China-Australia strategic economic dialogue. So there's a lot to do between the two countries. Common interests are self-evident, between the two nations. Can we say we do have a strong bedrock, between the two countries? The trade is important. The people-to-people relationship are strong there. That's something positive, and we should celebrate probably for the years to come.
Yeah, look, one thing I often tell people is that you should not imagine that Australia's China hawks, the often noisy voices in Australia that often dominate Australia's media, represent mainstream Australian public opinion. I want to be clear. Australians don't just have rosy thoughts about China. In our poll we do at the Australia-China Relations Institute, about 2/3 of Australians express concerns about China. But as you said, the way they think we should manage those concerns is through engagement and dialogue, not through confrontation and decoupling. And I think that's a very sensible position on the part of the Australian public. I also note that the Australian public in our polling rates the Albanese government's handling of China relations more highly than it did the Morrison government's handling. So I think that's the key thing for the Australian government, the current Australian government, to grasp. Their approach, this calm and professional diplomacy, is in fact in line with mainstream public opinion.
With all that positive elements, there, Dr. Ali, we have to, if you look into the future, let's say near future, with the U.S. presidential election campaign going on, and Donald Trump could well return to the White House. I mean, that's a fact probably many countries are embracing. For example, one of his advisors wrote recently that, once Donald Trump comes back to the White House, he should sever the entire economic relationship with China, resume nuclear tests, and send Marines to Asia. What will be the response from Asian countries?
I think it's fair to say that Donald Trump was a most atypical American president for many decades. In my studies, there is nothing quite like that experience, at least since the end of the First World War. So we're talking about a century now. He was very atypical, and he was very unpredictable. And of course, he was the one who proclaimed great power competition with China. But we also have to remember other things that have happened preceding the Trump presidency. The United States determined in April 1992 that it will be the dominant global power, and forever. This was a policy document which the Bush presidency signed off on the 23rd of April 1992. And in 1999, the 4th of August, another government office issued a document saying, looking to the future, signing off a document called Asia 2025, described China, and this in 1999, China was emerging as a constant competitor. The United States, which saw itself as a primate, a systemic primate forever, could not tolerate any rival rising which could compare itself to the former Soviet Union. And therefore, since then, President Clinton visited India and Vietnam, establishing the foundations of a proto-alliance eventually against China. President Bush was very busy with wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and fighting terrorism. But as soon as President Bush retired, Barack Obama came up with the pivot to Asia, something that he proclaimed in Canberra. And since then, although presidents and senior officials have been polite in the way they've expressed their views of China, Donald Trump was not so careful. But the general impression was that the United States must retain its systemic primacy, and China was the only country capable of challenging that. Not deliberately, as it happened, China acquired and accreted greater national power, and that challenged American primacy in American mind, and therefore China must be challenged, and that's what we are seeing today.
Mm-hmm. Well, James, if the U.S. And Trump, seek to sever, not entirely, let's say much of the ties, economic ties with China, send Marines to Asia, resuming nuclear tests, how will that affect Australia's China policy?
Australia will only become closer to China in that if an ultimatum of that nature gets issued to Canberra that we should sever economic ties with China, we would instantly refuse to do that because it's clearly not in our national interest. You know, there was a story back in the Obama administration days where where our former treasurer, Joe Hockey, said that Obama asked him to stop selling iron ore to China. We immediately refused. I imagine Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese today would immediately refuse as well. Not just because trade with China is good for Australian prosperity, but as I said before, our foreign minister says that trade is good for stability and security as well. So if the Donald Trump administration comes back with that sort of policy, I guarantee you Australia is not going to be part of it.
Well, with that, we concluded today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.